The departure. The city sparkled under the midnight sky, the rhythmic hum of car engines blending with the faint chatter of pedestrians. In a penthouse overlooking this restless metropolis, Richard Monroe, a self-made millionaire, sat nursing a glass of whiskey. The glow of his wealth surrounded him. Italian leather furniture, priceless art adorning the walls, and a view that seemed to promise he had conquered the world. But tonight, none of it satisfied him. His gaze lingered on a family portrait sitting on the mantel. It was from another life, a simpler one. In the photo, Emily, his wife, radiated warmth, her eyes sparkling with joy as she held their son, Ethan, then just a toddler. Richard stared at his own image in the photo, his smile strained and distant even then. The present-day Richard shook his head as his phone buzzed. A message from Claire lit up the screen. Claire was everything Emily wasn't. Young, vibrant, and completely unburdened by the responsibilities of family life. She was an escape, a thrill that helped Richard forget the monotony of his commitments. "Are you coming over tonight?" read Claire's text, accompanied by a picture of her holding a glass of champagne. Richard set down his drink and glanced back at the photo. The guilt was fleeting, smothered quickly by a rising sense of restlessness. He didn't belong in the domestic world Emily cherished, the small farm she adored, the home-cooked meals, the nights spent reading stories to Ethan. That wasn't the life he wanted. He grabbed his coat and walked toward the door. Emily's voice called softly from the kitchen. "Richard, dinner's ready. Ethan's excited to show you his school project." Her voice carried an undercurrent of hope, one that tugged at him briefly before he steeled himself. "I'll be late," he replied tersely, not waiting for her response. He didn't look back as he stepped out into the night. The rain drizzled as Richard's car weaved through the city streets. Claire's high-rise apartment was a world away from the warmth of his family's farmhouse. When he arrived, the atmosphere enveloped him immediately. Dim lighting, soft jazz playing in the background, and the intoxicating scent of her perfume. Claire greeted him with a smile that promised adventure, her slim figure wrapped in an elegant silk dress. She handed him a glass of champagne and led him to the balcony, where the city stretched endlessly before them. "Isn't this what life's about?" Claire whispered, her hand brushing against his. "Freedom, luxury, no obligations." Richard nodded, convincing himself she was right. Here he felt alive, unburdened by the weight of being a husband and father. Weeks turned into months. Richard buried himself in the hedonistic world he had chosen. Lavish parties, expensive getaways, and reckless investments became his norm. He bought his way into exclusivity, flaunting his wealth alongside Claire. Meanwhile, the farm he once called home grew distant in his memory. He rarely thought of Emily or Ethan, and when he did, he dismissed the pang of guilt. Surely they were better off without him, he reasoned. Emily had always been strong, resourceful. She would manage. But life in the fast lane proved unsustainable. The business deals that once seemed promising began to falter. Richard's empire, built on bold risks and borrowed funds, started to crumble. He doubled down on failing ventures, desperate to maintain the image of success. Claire, ever the opportunist, began to pull away. Her excuses became frequent, her laughter less warm. One day, she left without a word. Richard returned to his penthouse to find it devoid of her presence. The only trace she left behind was an empty champagne flute on the counter, a cruel reminder of the life he traded everything for. The silence in his penthouse became unbearable. It was no longer a haven but a prison of his own making. The city, once vibrant and full of promise, now seemed indifferent to his plight. One morning, as creditors circled like vultures, Richard received the final blow. His business was declared bankrupt. Everything he had built was gone. His properties, his cars, his accounts. The penthouse was seized, leaving him with nothing but a suitcase and the clothes on his back. With nowhere else to turn, Richard accepted a low-paying job at a luxury hotel, scrubbing floors and cleaning rooms. The work was grueling. but it kept him moving, kept him from dwelling too long on his fall from grace. Years passed. Richard aged rapidly, the weight of his mistakes etched into the lines of his face. The guests at the hotel, people he might have once considered peers, barely noticed him. He was invisible, a ghost haunting the halls. But then, one fateful day, as Richard polished the brass railing in the grand lobby, he froze. Across the room, a familiar face stepped into view. It was Emily. Her beauty, though matured, remained radiant. She walked with confidence, her hand resting gently on the arm of a man who exuded quiet strength. Beside them was a young man in his 20s, adjusting his cufflinks with an air of assurance. Richard's breath caught. It was Ethan. Though taller and leaner, there was no mistaking the boy he had abandoned. As the trio crossed the lobby, laughing softly, Richard felt the weight of his regrets crush him. He had thought of them often over the years, imagining their struggles, their pain. Yet here they were, thriving without him. Richard's world shattered as he watched them enter the elevator, disappearing from sight. The silence that followed was deafening. It wasn't just regret he felt. It was a profound, soul-crushing realization that they had moved on, leaving no room for him in their lives. This encounter would mark the beginning of Richard's journey, not one of redemption, but of understanding the magnitude of his choices and the people he had lost along the way. The fractured mirror. Richard stood frozen in the opulent hotel lobby, his hands trembling against the brass railing he had just polished. The laughter of his family, the one he had left behind, still echoed faintly in his ears, like a cruel melody playing on a loop. His heart raced as the elevator doors closed, taking Emily, Ethan, and the unfamiliar man away from him. A torrent of emotions surged within him, guilt, longing, and a burning curiosity. Who was the man at Emily's side? Was he just a friend, or had this man filled the void Richard had left behind? And Ethan, his son, now a grown man with an air of confidence Richard could hardly recognize. What had become of the boy who once idolized him? The polished brass in Richard's hand cooled as he loosened his grip. He stared at his reflection in the mirrored surface, distorted and dim under the lobby's golden lights. His uniform hung awkwardly on his frame, a stark reminder of how far he had fallen. The man staring back at him was a stranger, wrinkled, hollow-eyed, and burdened with regrets. That night, back in the small windowless room that served as the hotel staff's break area, Richard sat hunched over a cup of instant coffee. The bitter taste matched the weight in his chest. He replayed the brief encounter in his mind, dissecting every detail. The way Emily leaned into the man beside her, the warmth in Ethan's eyes as he spoke to them, the way they seemed so complete. "Rich, you okay?" asked Carlos, a fellow janitor who had grown accustomed to Richard's quiet demeanor. "Yeah," Richard muttered, his voice gruff. "Just tired." Carlos nodded, offering no further questions. It was an unspoken rule among the staff to mind their own business. But Richard wasn't tired. He was unraveling. Seeing Emily and Ethan after so many years stirred memories he had long buried. Richard's thoughts drifted back to the night he left. He remembered the look in Emily's eyes as she stood in the doorway, holding Ethan on her hip. Her voice, steady but pained, had followed him down the driveway. "Don't do this, Richard. Don't leave us." But he had left anyway, shutting the door on their pleas and on the life they had built together. He had convinced himself then that he was meant for more, that the farm was holding him back. But as he scrubbed the hotel's marble floors night after night, he realized the truth. He had been running from himself, from the fear of failure, from the weight of responsibility. The next day, Richard found himself lingering near the lobby during his break, hoping to catch another glimpse of Emily and Ethan. He felt pathetic, like a moth drawn to a flame that would inevitably burn him. Hours passed, and they didn't reappear. Instead, he overheard the concierge discussing an upcoming charity gala being held in the hotel ballroom. "Mrs. Monroe will be the guest of honor," one of the staff members said. Richard's heart skipped a beat. Emily was using his last name, his name, despite everything. He couldn't decide whether that was a sign of lingering affection or a practical choice for Ethan's sake. Either way, it reignited a desperate need within him to understand the life she had built after his departure. That evening, unable to contain his curiosity, Richard began asking subtle questions around the hotel. Most of the staff were happy to gossip, especially about the wealthy and influential guests they served. "Mrs. Monroe," said Marianne, a housekeeper Richard often worked with. "Oh, she's a gem. Classy, but never looks down on anyone. Her husband, Mark Edwards, is the same. Always polite, tips generously. They're hosting that gala for her music foundation." Music foundation. The word struck Richard like a blow. Emily had always loved playing the piano, but life on the farm had left little time for her to pursue it seriously. Had she returned to her passion after he left? Her son, too, Marianne continued. "Ethan. Smart, charming, and handsome. You should see the way people flock to him at these events. He's got the same confidence as his stepfather." Stepfather. The word landed heavily on Richard's chest. Mark Edwards wasn't just Emily's partner. He had taken on the role of father to Ethan. Richard clenched his jaw, his emotions swirling. He had no right to feel jealous, but the thought of another man stepping into his place felt like salt in a wound. Days turned into restless nights as Richard debated what to do. Should he try to speak with Emily? To Ethan? What would he even say? The night of the gala arrived, and Richard watched from the shadows as the ballroom transformed into a scene of elegance. Crystal chandeliers cast shimmering light over the room, and guests in designer gowns and tailored suits filled the space with lively chatter. Richard's position as a janitor gave him access to the backstage areas, where staff bustled to ensure the event ran smoothly. Peering discreetly from behind a curtain, Richard spotted Emily near the center of the room. She was stunning in a deep green gown, her posture graceful as she greeted guests. Mark stood at her side, his hand resting lightly on her back, a gesture of both support and intimacy. Ethan, now a man in his 20s, mingled confidently among the crowd, shaking hands and exchanging polite laughter. Richard's chest tightened. They looked so perfect. For a moment, he considered turning away, retreating back to the safety of his anonymity. But then Ethan glanced in his direction. Their eyes met, and time seemed to freeze. Ethan's brows furrowed, a flicker of recognition crossing his face. Richard's breath caught in his throat. He wanted to step forward, to explain himself, but the weight of his shame held him in place. Ethan hesitated for a moment before turning back to the conversation, dismissing Richard as just another hotel worker. The dismissal stung more than Richard anticipated. It wasn't anger or hatred that Ethan expressed. It was indifference. To his son, Richard was nobody. Later that night, after the guests had departed and the ballroom had emptied, Richard lingered in the shadows. He watched as Emily and Mark shared a quiet moment, their faces illuminated by the soft glow of the chandeliers. They seemed genuinely happy, their bond unshakable. Richard's heart ached with the realization that he had been replaced, not just as a husband, but as a father. Yet amidst the pain, there was a sliver of solace. Emily and Ethan had found happiness, even if it was without him. As he turned to leave, Richard felt a new sense of purpose. He couldn't undo the past, but perhaps there was still a way to make amends, not for their forgiveness, but for his own redemption. He resolved to find a way to atone for the pain he had caused, even if it meant doing so from a distance. The path forward was unclear, but for the first time in years, Richard felt a spark of hope. It was fragile, but it was enough to take the first step. The shadow of choices, the soft hum of machinery filled the silence as Richard sat in the janitor's closet, staring at the worn family photograph he kept tucked in his wallet. It was the last relic of his old life, a snapshot of a summer afternoon on the farm. Emily's hair was windswept, her smile radiant, as she held a giggling Ethan high above her head. Richard stood beside them, his expression half-formed, distracted even then. His fingers traced the faded edges of the photo as he tried to reconcile the man he was with the man he had become. The sight of Emily and Ethan at the gala had left an indelible mark on him, one that no amount of scrubbing floors or sleepless nights could erase. Seeing them happy, successful, and seemingly complete without him was both a relief and a dagger to his heart. The image of Ethan, confident, composed, and utterly indifferent, haunted him most. He had spent years imagining his son's life, conjuring scenarios where Ethan might need him, miss him, even resent him. But reality had delivered a far colder truth. Ethan didn't hate him because he didn't think of him at all. Richard wasn't even a footnote in the life his son had built. The days that followed were an exercise in futility. Richard moved through his shifts like a ghost, the weight of his encounter with Emily and Ethan dragging him down. Every gleaming surface he polished reflected his fractured self back at him. He avoided the bustling chatter of the hotel staff, retreating into the corners where silence was his only companion. But the questions wouldn't leave him. Who was Mark Edwards, really? What kind of man had taken his place so seamlessly? Richard's bitterness whispered that Mark had simply been lucky, stepping into a family that was already whole. But deep down, he knew the truth. Mark had earned his place through effort and care, the very things Richard had failed to offer. One evening, while clearing the lounge area after a small gathering, Richard overheard a conversation between two guests. "Mark Edwards is a genius," one man said, swirling his glass of wine. "Not just in business, but in how he supports Helena Monroe. He's the backbone of her foundation. I heard he's planning to open a new music school in her name," the other replied. "It's incredible how far she's come, especially given her past." Richard froze mid-step. A music school. Emily's foundation. His mind raced. When they were married, Emily's piano was her sanctuary, her escape from the endless chores and financial strain of the farm. He had dismissed it as a hobby, a distraction from the real work of keeping their lives afloat. Yet here she was, not only pursuing her passion, but building an empire around it, with Mark's help. Driven by a mix of curiosity and regret, Richard began piecing together the fragments of Emily's new life. He scored guest logs, lingered near conversations he wasn't meant to hear, and even borrowed a discarded newspaper featuring an article about her foundation. Each detail painted a picture of a woman who had not only survived but thrived. Emily had transformed her passion into a mission, using her foundation to fund music education for underprivileged children. The gala was just one of many events she hosted to raise awareness and support. But the more Richard learned, the more he felt like an intruder in a story that no longer belonged to him. One late evening, as Richard wheeled a cart of linens through a deserted hallway, he saw a figure seated at the grand piano in the hotel lounge. The soft, melodic strains of Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata floated through the air, tender and deliberate. He rounded the corner and stopped short. It was Emily. Her back was to him, her posture straight and elegant as her fingers glided over the keys. The years had refined her playing, turning what once was a hobby into something profound. Richard stayed hidden in the shadows, unable to tear his eyes away. She was mesmerizing, completely lost in the music. For a brief moment, the weight of their shared past seemed to dissolve, replaced by an overwhelming sense of admiration. When the final note faded, Emily sat in silence for a moment before rising and walking toward the elevator. Richard's heart pounded as he debated whether to step forward, to say something, anything. But his courage faltered, and he let her pass by without a word. The next morning, as Richard prepared for his shift, he noticed a flyer on the staff bulletin board. It was an announcement for Emily's next major event, a groundbreaking ceremony for the music school. The ceremony would take place at a nearby venue, open to the public. Richard stared at the flyer, his emotions warring within him. He wanted to go, to witness the life she had built firsthand. But he also feared what he might find, more evidence of how deeply he had been replaced. Yet something inside him, a voice he hadn't heard in years, urged him to face the truth, no matter how painful. The day of the ceremony arrived, and Richard found himself standing at the back of the crowd. The venue was alive with energy, filled with attendees eager to support Emily's vision. A stage had been set up with a podium, and banners displayed the foundation's logo alongside the words, "Inspiring the next generation of music." Emily took the stage, her presence commanding yet approachable. She spoke with passion, sharing her journey and the importance of music in her life. The crowd erupted in applause, their admiration palpable. Richard watched, his heart heavy with both pride and sorrow. This was the woman he had once called his wife, a woman he had underestimated and taken for granted. She had risen from the ashes of their fractured marriage, not as a victim, but as a force to be reckoned with. As the event concluded, Richard lingered near the exit, hoping for a chance to speak with Emily. But when she finally appeared, flanked by Mark and Ethan, his resolve faltered. They were laughing, their bond evident in every gesture and glance. They looked like a family, a real family. For a moment, Richard considered leaving, retreating back into the anonymity that had become his refuge. But then Emily glanced his way, her expression shifting as their eyes met. She paused, her smile fading into something more complex, recognition mixed with caution. "Richard," she said, her tone steady but distant. Mark and Ethan turned to follow her gaze, their expressions unreadable. Richard opened his mouth to speak, but the words caught in his throat. He had prepared a dozen speeches, rehearsed countless apologies, but none of them felt adequate. Instead, he managed only 3 words. "I'm so sorry." Emily studied him for a moment, her face unreadable. Then, without a word, she turned and walked away, Mark and Ethan following close behind. As their silhouettes disappeared into the crowd, Richard felt a strange sense of finality. He hadn't earned forgiveness, nor had he expected it, but he had taken the first step, acknowledging his failure, not for their sake, but for his own. For the first time in years, Richard felt a glimmer of something he hadn't dared hope for, the possibility of redemption. It would be a long road, and he wasn't sure where it would lead. But as he walked away from the venue, his footsteps felt lighter, and the weight of his regrets seemed just a little less suffocating. Chance at redemption. The days after the groundbreaking ceremony were a blur for Richard. The brief encounter with Emily had left him raw, her silence more damning than any words she could have spoken. Yet there was something in her gaze that lingered in his mind, a flicker of acknowledgement, perhaps even understanding. For the first time, he allowed himself to entertain the possibility that he could begin to make amends, even if the path ahead seemed insurmountable. At night, as he lay on the thin mattress of his cramped apartment, the memories of the life he had abandoned crept back to him. He thought of Emily at the piano, playing for Ethan as a child. He remembered Ethan's wide-eyed curiosity, and the way he'd tug at Richard's sleeve, eager to show him a drawing or ask him endless questions. These were the moments he had traded for fleeting pleasures, and now they haunted him like ghosts. One evening, as Richard scrubbed the marble floors of the hotel lobby, an unexpected figure entered his world. Ethan. He was alone this time, dressed in a tailored suit and carrying an air of quiet authority. He stopped at the front desk, speaking briefly to the concierge. Richard watched from a distance, his heart pounding. Ethan turned and spotted him. Their eyes met, and for a moment, Richard thought he might walk away. But instead, Ethan approached, his stride deliberate and confident. "You're the janitor, right?" Ethan asked, his voice calm but edged with something sharp. Richard straightened, his throat dry. "Yes," he replied, barely above a whisper. Ethan studied him, his expression unreadable. "You were at the groundbreaking ceremony." Richard hesitated, unsure of how much Ethan knew. "I was," he admitted. I wanted to see her." Ethan's jaw tightened. "You mean my mother?" Richard nodded, feeling the weight of those words. "Yes, your mother. And you." Ethan's gaze didn't waver. "Why? After all these years, why now?" Richard struggled to find the right words. Because I was a coward, he said finally, his voice breaking. I ran away from everything that mattered, and I've spent every day since regretting it. I don't expect you to forgive me. I don't deserve that. But I needed to see the life you've built, to know you're okay. Ethan's expression softened slightly, though his guard remained up. You don't get to come back and ask for forgiveness. You don't get to undo what you did. I know, Richard said, his shoulders sagging. I know I can't fix what I broke, but if there's anything I can do, anything at all, I want to try. Ethan stared at him for a long moment before speaking. You don't fix things by showing up out of nowhere. You fix them by showing you've changed. Actions, not words. Richard nodded, his heart heavy with the truth of those words. You're right, he said. You're absolutely right. The encounter with Ethan stayed with Richard, driving him to take the first real steps toward change. He began volunteering at a local shelter, offering to clean and maintain the facilities in his spare time. The work was hard and thankless, but it gave him purpose. He donated the little money he could spare to causes that supported struggling families, hoping to make a difference, even if in small ways. He also sought therapy, a step he had avoided for years. Through these sessions, he confronted the choices that had led him to this point, unraveling the layers of fear, pride, and insecurity that had driven him to abandon his family. It was a painful process, but one that began to give him clarity. Months passed, and Richard's transformation didn't go unnoticed. His colleagues at the hotel, once indifferent to his presence, began to respect his quiet determination. Carlos, who had always been friendly but distant, offered words of encouragement. Rich, you've been different lately, he said one evening. You've got this fire in you. Keep it up, man. Richard smiled faintly. It wasn't much, but it was a start. One day, as he was finishing his shift, Richard received a message from the shelter where he volunteered. They were hosting a charity event to raise funds for their programs and needed extra hands. Richard agreed immediately, eager to contribute. The event was modest but heartfelt, held in a small community center. Families gathered, sharing meals and stories. As Richard moved through the crowd, helping wherever he could, he felt a sense of belonging he hadn't experienced in years. Toward the end of the evening, as he was stacking chairs, a familiar voice stopped him in his tracks. Richard. He turned, and there she was, Emily. She stood at the edge of the room, her expression a mixture of surprise and curiosity. Emily, he said, his voice faltering. I didn't know you'd be here. I didn't know you'd be here either, she replied, stepping closer. What are you doing? I volunteer here, he said simply. It's something I can do to give back. Emily studied him, her gaze searching. You've changed. Richard swallowed hard. I'm trying. It's the least I can do. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then, Emily's expression softened. Ethan told me he spoke to you. He did, Richard said. And he was right. Words mean nothing without action. Emily nodded. He's a good man. He's grown into someone I'm proud of. Richard smiled faintly. He's everything I wasn't. That's because of you. Emily's eyes shimmered with emotion, but she held steady. Maybe. But people can change, Richard. It's not too late. Her words hung in the air, offering a glimmer of hope. For the first time in years, Richard felt the weight of his past lift ever so slightly. He wasn't forgiven, not yet, but he was on the path. And for now, that was enough. Confronting the past. The weeks following the chance encounter with Emily at the shelter felt like a delicate balance between hope and uncertainty for Richard. Her words lingered in his mind. People can change, Richard. It's not too late. They carried a quiet power, one that ignited a fire in him he hadn't felt in years. But he knew those words were not a promise, only an acknowledgement of his efforts thus far. Richard continued to work tirelessly, both at the hotel and the shelter. Each act of service, however small, felt like a step closer to becoming the man he had failed to be. But the shadows of his past loomed large, and the one connection he had yet to fully confront was the one that weighed on him the most: Ethan. One crisp autumn morning, Richard received an unexpected call from the director of the shelter. They had received a generous donation from an anonymous benefactor, but the director suspected it had come from someone within Emily Monroe's circle. Her son, Ethan Edwards, has been involved in several philanthropic efforts lately. The director explained. I thought you might know something about this. Richard's heart raced. Ethan, it seemed, had inherited Emily's drive to help others. But why would he direct his efforts here, to the very place where Richard volunteered? The thought filled him with both dread and hope. Perhaps it was a sign that Ethan was willing to keep the door cracked open, even slightly. Later that evening, Richard stayed late at the shelter, cleaning up after a busy day. As he wiped down tables, the door opened, and a familiar figure stepped inside. Ethan. His tailored coat and confident stride stood out in the humble setting, but his expression was serious. Ethan, Richard said, his voice trembling. Ethan crossed his arms, leaning against the doorframe. I heard you've been volunteering here. Richard nodded, unsure of where this was going. I have. For a while now. Why? Ethan's tone wasn't accusatory, but it held a weight that demanded honesty. Richard set down the cloth he was holding and faced his son. Because I needed to do something meaningful, something that wasn't about me. After everything I've done, it's the least I can do. Ethan studied him for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he stepped further into the room, pulling out a chair and sitting down. Tell me the truth, Richard. Why did you leave us? The question struck Richard like a blow. He had rehearsed this moment in his mind countless times, but now that it was here, he found himself struggling to articulate the depth of his regret. I left because I was afraid, he said finally, his voice breaking. I was afraid of failing you and your mother. I thought if I chased success, I could give you both a better life. But that was a lie. The truth is, I was selfish. I wanted the world, and I left behind the people who meant the most to me. Ethan's jaw tightened, but he didn't interrupt. I know I can't undo what I did, Richard continued, and I don't expect you to forgive me, but I want you to know that I think about you every day. I think about the boy I left behind, and the man you've become, and I'm proud of you, Ethan. I don't have the right to say that, but I am. For a moment, the room was silent. Then Ethan leaned back in his chair, his gaze steady. You're right. You don't have the right. But I'll tell you something, Richard. Growing up without you wasn't easy. Mom had to be strong for both of us, and Mark stepped in when you didn't. He taught me how to be a man. Richard nodded, his chest tightening with both gratitude and pain. He's a good man. I can see that. But Ethan continued, his voice softening. I've also learned that holding on to anger doesn't help anyone. It's exhausting. So I'd let it go. I don't hate you, Richard, but that doesn't mean I can forget. Richard felt a lump rise in his throat. I don't deserve your forgiveness, Ethan. But hearing that, it means more than I can say. Ethan stood, his posture firm but not unkind. You're trying. I can see that. Maybe that's enough for now. As Ethan turned to leave, Richard called after him. Ethan. Ethan paused, glancing over his shoulder. Thank you, Richard said, for giving me this chance to explain. Ethan gave a small nod, then walked out, leaving Richard alone in the quiet shelter. For the first time in years, Richard felt a fragile sense of peace. It wasn't full reconciliation, but it was a beginning. The encounter with Ethan gave Richard a renewed sense of purpose. He continued his work at the shelter, but now he felt less like he was running from his past and more like he was working towards something meaningful. Slowly, he began to rebuild his life, not as a wealthy man, but as a man who had learned the value of humility and service. Word of his transformation began to spread, reaching even the ears of Emily. One evening, as Richard walked home from the shelter, he received a call. The number was unfamiliar, but he answered. "Richard," came Emily's voice, warm but cautious. "I've been hearing about the work you've been doing. Ethan told me you spoke." "We did," Richard replied. "It wasn't easy, but it was something I needed to do." "I'm glad," Emily said after a pause. "Perhaps there's more to discuss when you're ready." Richard felt a lump in his throat. "Thank you, Emily, for even considering it." Her voice softened. "People can change, Richard, and sometimes they deserve a second chance." As the call ended, Richard stood in the fading light of the evening, the city quiet around him. The road ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, he felt a glimmer of hope, a chance to make things right, not just for his family, but for himself. A fragile reunion. Months passed, and Richard continued his quiet journey of self-redemption. He had stopped looking for quick fixes and grand gestures, realizing that the only way forward was through consistent, meaningful action. His days were filled with work at the hotel and volunteering at the shelter, and while his nights still carried the weight of loneliness, they no longer felt unbearable. Slowly but surely, he was rebuilding his life, piece by fragile piece. Then one day, a letter arrived at the shelter. The director handed it to him with a curious smile. "Looks like someone's been paying attention to your hard work," she said. Richard hesitated before opening it. Inside was an elegant invitation to a private dinner at Emily and Mark's home. It was handwritten, the ink bold and deliberate. "Richard, we've seen the changes you've been making, and Ethan has spoken about your efforts. I think it's time we have a proper conversation. Join us for dinner this Saturday at 7 p.m. Let's see where this takes us. Emily." Richard stared at the invitation, his hands trembling. It was a chance he had never expected, one that filled him with both hope and dread. The idea of sitting at the same table as Emily, Mark, and Ethan felt almost surreal. What could he say to them that hadn't already been said? Would they truly want to hear him, or was this simply closure for their benefit? The days leading up to the dinner were a blur of nervous preparation. Richard borrowed a suit from Carlos, who insisted on helping him look presentable. He rehearsed his words in front of the mirror, discarding one speech after another. On the evening of the dinner, he stood outside Emily and Mark's home, a modest yet elegant house nestled in a quiet neighborhood. It was far removed from the life of luxury he had once imagined for himself, but it exuded warmth and stability. Everything he had forsaken. He rang the doorbell, his heart pounding. The door opened, and there stood Ethan, his expression calm but not unfriendly. "Richard," Ethan said with a small nod. "Come in." Richard stepped inside, feeling the weight of the moment. The home was cozy, filled with the scent of freshly cooked food and the sound of soft music playing in the background. Emily appeared from the kitchen, wiping her hands on a towel. She wore a simple dress, her smile warm but reserved. "Richard," she said, her voice steady, "I'm glad you came." "Thank you for inviting me," Richard replied, his voice almost breaking. Mark entered next, tall and composed, extending a hand. "Richard, good to meet you." The handshake was firm, and though Mark's expression was neutral, there was no animosity in his eyes. Richard appreciated the grace of the man who had stepped into his place and done so with dignity. Dinner was both a trial and a revelation. The conversation began tentatively, with Mark and Emily asking polite questions about Richard's life now. He answered honestly, sharing the struggles he faced and the work he was doing at the shelter. Ethan chimed in occasionally, offering small insights into his own life, but he mostly observed, his sharp eyes taking in every word. As the evening wore on, the tension began to ease. Emily spoke about her music foundation, and Richard listened intently, marveling at how she had turned her passion into something so impactful. Mark shared stories of their travels, and Ethan talked about his own career in finance. When the conversation turned to the past, Richard braced himself. "I know I've caused a lot of pain," Richard said, his voice low. "And I know I can never undo what I've done. But I want you all to know how sorry I am." I'm not here to make excuses, only to acknowledge the harm I caused and to thank you for letting me be here tonight." Emily was the first to respond, her voice soft but firm. "Richard, we've had to rebuild our lives without you. It wasn't easy, but we did it. And while I'll never forget what happened, I've learned to forgive, not for your sake, but for mine." Richard nodded, his throat tight with emotion. "I understand." Mark leaned forward, his tone calm. "Richard, I won't pretend to know what you went through or why you made the choices you did. But I can see that you're trying now. And that means something. If you're willing to keep working at this, I think there's room for something." Ethan, who had remained mostly silent, finally spoke. "I don't know if I can ever think of you as a father again," he said bluntly. "But I'm willing to see what happens, one step at a time." Those words, though cautious, felt like a lifeline to Richard. He nodded, his voice barely audible. "Thank you. That's more than I deserve." As the evening wound down, Emily walked Richard to the door. The air between them was lighter now. The tension eased, but not entirely gone. "You've changed, Richard," she said. "I can see that. Just don't stop. This is a long road, and it's not going to be easy." "I won't," Richard promised. "Thank you for giving me this chance." Emily nodded, her expression unreadable but not unkind. "Good night, Richard." As he stepped out into the cool night air, Richard felt a mix of exhaustion and hope. The path ahead was uncertain, and he knew there were no guarantees. But for the first time in years, he felt like he was moving towards something real. A chance to be part of their lives, however small. The stars above seemed brighter as he walked away, a man humbled by his past, but determined to forge a better future. A fragile reunion. Richard walked away from Emily and Mark's house with a mixture of emotions swirling in his chest. There was relief, guilt, hope, and a lingering uncertainty about what the future held. The night had been more than he expected and less than he hoped for, but it was a start, a fragile bridge built on honesty and mutual respect. For the first time in years, Richard allowed himself to hope that he might find a place, however small, in their lives again. The following weeks passed quietly but purposefully. Richard threw himself into his work at the shelter, not because he was trying to impress anyone, but because it had become a source of fulfillment. His time there reminded him of what he had taken for granted: community, compassion, and the quiet strength of helping others. One afternoon, as he was organizing donations, his phone buzzed. He rarely received calls, so the unknown number caught his attention. Hesitantly, he answered. "Richard, it's Ethan." Richard's breath caught. "Ethan, hi. I wasn't expecting to hear from you. I wanted to ask if you're free this weekend," Ethan said, his tone casual but firm. "Mom's hosting a small gathering for the foundation. I think it'd be good if you came. Low stakes, nothing formal." Richard's heart raced. I'd like that." "Thank you, Ethan." "Don't thank me yet," Ethan said with a faint chuckle. "Just show up." On the day of the gathering, Richard arrived early, wanting to ensure he didn't disrupt the event. The venue was smaller than the gala he had seen months earlier, but no less elegant. A warm, welcoming atmosphere filled the room as guests mingled, chatting about the foundation's latest accomplishments. Richard spotted Emily across the room, speaking with a group of donors. She caught his eye and gave him a brief nod, a silent acknowledgement that carried more weight than words. Mark was nearby, his presence steady and reassuring as he helped manage the event. Ethan approached Richard with a drink in hand. "You made it," he said, handing over the glass. "I wasn't going to miss it," Richard replied, his voice steady despite the butterflies in his stomach. Ethan gestured toward the stage, where a young girl was performing on the piano. "She's one of the scholarship recipients. Mom's foundation gave her the opportunity to study music." Richard watched the girl play, her small hands gliding over the keys with a mixture of precision and passion. "She's incredible," he said softly. "She is," Ethan agreed. He hesitated before adding, when I was younger, I didn't understand why Mom was so obsessed with music. I thought it was just her way of escaping reality. But now, seeing what she's built, I get it. It's not just about the music. It's about giving people something to hold on to. Richard nodded, his throat tightening. She's remarkable, he said. You both are. Ethan glanced at him, his expression softening. I'm starting to think you might be too. You've still got a long way to go, but you're trying. That counts for something. Richard felt a lump rise in his throat. Thank you, Ethan. That means more than you know. As the evening wound down, Emily approached Richard, her smile warm but cautious. Thank you for coming tonight, she said. It was good to see you here. I'm glad you invited me, Richard replied. Everything you've built, it's extraordinary, Emily. I'm so proud of you. Her smile faltered slightly, and she looked away for a moment before meeting his gaze. I appreciate that, Richard. And I see the changes you've been making. Keep going. Don't let this be temporary. I won't, he promised. I spent too much time running. I'm not going back. Emily nodded, her expression softening. Good, because if this is the man you're becoming, there might be room for you in our lives someday. As Richard left the event that night, he felt a quiet sense of fulfillment. He knew the road ahead was still long, and there were no guarantees of full reconciliation. But he had taken meaningful steps, and for the first time in years, he felt like he belonged. Not fully, but enough to keep moving forward. Under the soft glow of the streetlights, Richard smiled to himself. He wasn't the man he had been, and he wasn't yet the man he wanted to be, but he was becoming something better, one day at a time. And that, he realized, was enough.